This organization gives 2 awards each year, one in the name of Dr. Teller and one in the name of Dr. Bettman, given to the people whom, in the case of the man who's still living, his opinion, and in our opinion for Dr. Bettman, best represent through the work and things that they have done the finest attributes of these men. The next speaker is Dr. Balinus. She'll talk to us about global warming, but before that, I'm going to give Dr. Balinus this year's Peter Beckman Award.
Thank you. Well, hello, old friends. I'm very surprised, honored. Oh, this is beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, in exchange for this great honor, I'm going to do you a favor, and that's relieve you of the nightmares of global warming and the havoc that you've been reading about in the newspapers that are alleged to occur. Now, what are the scientific facts in support of the claim that man-made global warming will be significant or even catastrophic? So first, I will discuss the lack of a scientific basis for these claims of large global warming. With that established, I will visit news reports on the alleged havoc coming from man-made global warming. And finally, I will discuss the ineffectiveness and disastrous consequences in economics proposed policies that would cut the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, human actions like fossil fuel burning release global warming gases, the minor gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and as they increase in the atmosphere, they help retain some of the heat that would otherwise escape from the Earth into space. So an increase in their concentration means that the average surface temperature of the Earth ought to rise, all things being equal. That's the hypothesis. And there are computer simulations of the Earth's climate that try to calculate the hypothesized warming due to the increases in the greenhouse gases. And the best guess of the latest United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is usually abbreviated the IPCC, is a warming of about 2.5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. Now, the rules of science give clear guidance on how to test this hypothesis, or indeed any hypothesis. Hypothesis must be verified by experiment. In the case of human-made global warming and its consequences, the computer simulations of the climate must be verified before they can be used for serious policy discussions. And I want to emphasize my precise use of the 2 words, hypothesis and theory. A hypothesis is a working conjecture, and a theory is a hypothesis that has been confirmed by observations and experiment, i.e. by facts. So how do we test the validity of the computer forecasts of climate 100 years in the future? That is, how do we test the hypothesis of man-made global warming? Well, we'll start by noting that the increase in different greenhouse gases over the last 100 years is effectively equal to a 50% increase in carbon dioxide alone. So we'll speak about a 50% increase of equivalent carbon dioxide. Now, this 50% increase is halfway to a doubling of carbon dioxide, and the doubling is the benchmark that the IPCC and many other models use in calculating the climate impacts. So we've gone halfway to a doubling in the last 100 years, and so we can simply test the models by measuring the response of the Earth's climate system to this equivalent 50% increase in carbon dioxide that has already occurred. So we'll test this hypothesis in 3 ways. First, we'll compare the computer predictions to the temperature record of the last 100 years. And we'll compare the computer predictions to very precise temperature measurements made by satellite over the last 18 years, in particular to temperatures in the Arctic region. Now, according to these computer forecasts, the last 18 years are very important because this is a period in which the Earth's temperature should be rising rapidly because the man-made greenhouse activities are greenhouse gases are building up quite rapidly. And the Arctic is very important because the forecasts say that the Arctic temperatures rise fastest of all and thus provide a very strict test of the man-made greenhouse warming hypothesis. Now, the bottom line, the result is that testing the climate forecasts reveals that the predictions fail in every major way to describe the real world. The comparison with the temperatures actually observed shows that the forecasts are exaggerating the warming by a large factor, perhaps as much as a factor of 10. No evidence can be found in any of the temperature measurements to support the hypothesis of a significant man-made global warming, much less a catastrophic warming. Let's review 3 of the major tests of the climate forecasts, and then the failure of those forecasts to explain measurements of the climate in order to show why the predictions of a large temperature rise are wrong. And the first slide, thanks, is a 100-year record of the temperature of the Earth. And it's very important because it covers the period in which the greenhouse gases have increased by this 50%, effective 50% rise in carbon dioxide. Now, the computer models predict that as a result of that 50% increase in carbon dioxide, there should already be a warming of 1 to 2 degrees centigrade globally in the temperature. Now, how do the models test against the real-world measurements? The temperature record shows an increase of 0.5 degree centigrade. The temperature record here is the green one, the top one, the observed temperature record from about 1880 to the present. The latest, one of the latest models, and this is one with not only the greenhouse gases but the shading effect of aerosols, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is the model in pink. Now, at first glance, it might seem that there is apparent success here. The amount of warming that the model is asking to have been observed is 0.5 degree centigrade. The amount, the net warming over the last 100 years has been about 0.5 degree centigrade. So you might say, well, this is a validation of the models. Bad luck. That conclusion is false because it ignores one of the most important features of the temperature record. And if you only remember one thing from my talk, please remember this. Most of the warming of the Earth occurred before 1940. But if you look at the temperature prediction, this temperature prediction mirrors what the greenhouse gas buildup has been. So ignore that side of the chart, and on this side, there really has been not much of an increase in greenhouse gases early in the century, and therefore not much of the warming, and all the warming occurs after, say, World War II. So most of the warming occurs early in the century. Most of the prediction warming is for after in the century, later, second half of the century, where there has not been much net warming at all. The buildup of man-made greenhouse gases, or greenhouse gases in general this century, cannot be the cause of this warming that occurred between 1880 and 1940. Most of the warming is thus natural that occurred early in the century, and we can talk later about what such natural variability might be due to. Now, of this 0.5 degree centigrade rise this century, only perhaps 1 or maybe 0.2 of a centigrade at most can be attributed to carbon dioxide increases. Now, that is insignificant because it's indistinguishable from the natural fluctuations of the global temperature. They fluctuate naturally by several tenths of a degree on this time scale. Now, remembering that the computer forecast said that this 50% increase in carbon dioxide should have produced a 1 to 2 degrees centigrade warming, yet we can only find at most 1/10 or 2/10 degrees centigrade of warming, we see that the computer forecasts are exaggerating the warming that should have already occurred. And they're exaggerating it by how much? A factor of 10. The second test are temperature records from the Arctic. Now, according to the computer forecast, the polar areas are very sensitive to global warming. The forecasts say that the polar region should have warmed by an incredible 3 to 8 degrees centigrade already in the last 50 to 100 years. And that's enough to begin melting polar ice in some areas. Now, melting of the polar ice then produces a positive feedback that amplifies any warming. The reason is that the ice reflects sunlight and helps keep the polar regions cold. But as the temperature rises and the ice melts, you're left with bare ground or bare sea underneath that absorbs more of the energy from the sun and then magnifies the warming. So the Arctic would be very sensitive. Now if we can have the first view graph. I didn't have time. These are very recent data. There are precise surface measurements made by weather balloons starting in the year 1957, and they directly contradict the predictions of man-made greenhouse warming. This, on the average, over the last 40 years, there's been no observed warming. And this is the prediction of significant warming if you look at the scale, several degrees centigrade, over the last 40 years. And the Arctic, in the test of looking at the temperature record of the Arctic compared to the computer forecasts, the forecasts are now exaggerating the warming by more than a factor of 10-fold. So the Arctic is really an acid test of what's gone on. Thanks for them. I'm going to return to that one later. So you can turn off the view graph. Now, in the past 18 years, there have been very precise readings of temperature over nearly the entire surface of the Earth, unlike the surface records I showed you, which going back to 1880 cover maybe tens of % of the surface of the Earth and very, very little of the ocean. So in 1979, satellites were launched to look at the entire Earth, and they only miss about 1.25 degrees of latitude right at the polar caps. So they are essentially global in nature. These are very accurate readings of the Earth's temperature, and the computers predict that in the last 2 decades, the buildup of greenhouse gases is now so large that the global temperature should be rising 0.2 to 0.3 degrees centigrade per decade. This is large enough to see against the natural variability of the climate fluctuations. But the satellite data contradict that. Huh? Yeah. The global temperature of the Earth, it's been cooling, and the predictions are that we should have been seeing a net rise, a net slope in those data. So these very precise measurements say that, once again, the satellite readings say that there is much exaggeration in the models. And if we just show the second view graph, we now use the satellite data to go back to the Arctic. And this is the same prediction as in the other slide, but it's over a much shorter interval, so it doesn't look as steep. But I've kept the chart on the same vertical scale. There should have been a several degree, 1.5 degree rise in the Arctic, 1 to 1.5 degrees over the last nearly 2 decades. And the observed temperature, and these are the very latest values, are that there's been no net warming. Again, the satellite readings contradict the computer forecasts and say that they are exaggerating. Thank you. That's all I'll need from the view graphs. Now, in the face of all this, when asked about the vast disagreement between his computer predictions and the satellite measurements, Dr. James Hansen of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies of NASA said, "If there's a greenhouse warming, it should be visible in the satellite data. The fact that it isn't tells me there's something wrong with the data." But the problem is that the satellite data have been verified independently by the balloon weather stations. That is, the balloons are launched and look at the same areas where the satellite data look, and there is almost perfect agreement. And the correlation between satellite data and, say, very densely sampled surface areas like North America, which has very good records going back nearly 100 years, show a correlation coefficient with the satellite data of 98%, and that's nearly perfect agreement. Now, these comparisons show that the satellite data are indeed reliable. It is more reasonable to conclude that there is something wrong with the models. Now, what could be wrong with the models? In a review article in Nature in 1992, Dr. Moush Shaheen, who is presently the chief scientist at NASA JPL, concluded the following: "The errors in calculating the basic greenhouse effect remain too large by an order of magnitude to let us determine the impact of increased carbon dioxide on global warming. More recently, in January 1997, two climate modelers said the following: "We conclude that the general circulation model cannot be used for any physical experiment devoted to studying the real climate change, such as greenhouse warming." And these same two modelers later in March said the following: "It is clear that using the general circulation model for investigation of the real climate variability has no scientific justification." Now, as new physics is learned, the computer projections have changed quite a bit. This is the history of predictions made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and their results have cooled significantly in the past few years. And in fact, the latest model coming out of NCAR has predicts a warming in the year 2100 of 1 degree. I'd have to plot it there. And that doesn't even have a cooling or shading effect from aerosols. I presume if they put it in, there'd be no warming, and that would be too embarrassing to publish. But based on the history of predictions here, I can make a prediction. I can extrapolate this to the future, which is that linear fit there. On March 22nd, near noon in 2001, a warming of 0 degrees centigrade will be predicted by the UN. Now, against this backdrop of scientific ignorance, the puzzle is why the computer forecasts are considered reliable for policy discussions. Now, let's turn this into something positive. What is the maximum amount of warming due to increased greenhouse gases that can be expected to occur if we adjust these exaggerated forecasts to the limits allowed by the actual temperature measurements? That is, factor in their exaggeration of a factor of 10, and what do you predict for the future? The answer is that the corrected warming in the next century, at present rates of increase in the greenhouse gases, will be less than a few tenths of a degree centigrade. Spread over a century, that will be indistinguishable from the noise in the temperature record. That means there will be no man-made global warming. We can all sleep better. Now let's have some fun. I want to look at some news stories. So we have the good news here. The facts, courtesy of the scientific method, say that global warming over the next century from man-made greenhouse gases will be insignificant compared to the natural temperature fluctuations in the climate. But there's bad news. The galaxy is going to pot. That means that the public isn't allowed to hear about this good news. And why, I don't know. That's a sociological question. But having the facts of the science of global warming, I want to then deconstruct 4 major themes that have been in recent news stories concerning human-made global warming and its possible impacts. The first one is one that's been out for about a year. It's the following sentence: "The balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate." This is a very important sentence from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Summary for Policymakers published last year. It's a soundbite mantra that's parroted by the media, despite the fact, the hard test of reality, showing that the computer simulations fail to represent reality. According to the IPCC, the origin of this conclusion is based on computer models of the climate. Supposedly very modern models, which now include the effect of aerosols as well as the greenhouse gases, the same model I showed you, for example, in the first slide. Now, why are aerosols so interesting? Aerosol pollutants like sulfur dioxide form a haze that shades the surface of the Earth from the sun. With that shading effect added to the computer models, the temperature predictions are less warm, which brings them much closer to reality. We know the computer projections have been exaggerating the warming. So the fear is that there's an ever-increasing amount of cooling by aerosol pollutants that just might counterbalance the increased warming due to the buildup of greenhouse gases and fool us into thinking there is really no man-made global warming, but something very dangerous lurking below. Now, in the IPCC science report, it was claimed that these models of greenhouse gases plus aerosols were validated by a comparison to actual measurements. That's good news. The test compared the model's results to data from the region where the computer simulations predict the most warming, namely the troposphere over the southern oceans. So in concept, this is an excellent test. We're going to look at the models, and the models predict that there should have been a large warming over the southern oceans. If that's true, then we're one step towards validation. Unfortunately, the modelers conducted a bad test. And let me show you. This is the temperature record over the southern latitude oceans in the troposphere. And in the paper that claimed validation, the modelers showed the data in pink. And the data in pink have an increasing trend that was very similar to what was predicted from the computer models. But they didn't show the full interval of the data available to them, which is the data I've added in green. And when we fit a trend through the data in green, it's insignificantly different from zero. There is no net warming. So the models claim, the claim that the model is validated is incorrect. Now, interestingly, two of the authors of the main chapter in the IPCC where this study was shown actually almost simultaneously published another paper in a science journal. And that paper is very interesting. In that paper, these two main authors, Santer is one of them, Barnett the other, said that it is hard to say that an anthropogenic climate signal has or has not been detected. Contrast that with the statement they made in the IPCC document saying the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on the climate. Now, I call this paper their confession to God. The main basis for this widely quoted statement of the IPCC on the discernible human influence has been overturned by the data, and the modelers have now admitted it. Hurricanes are an interesting, timely topic in the news. There's been no increase in the total number of Atlantic hurricanes in the last 100 years. From year to year, there is significant difference in the number of hurricanes, and 1995 and 1996 had higher than average storminess, but those above average years are counterbalanced by a dearth of hurricanes in the years prior to them, making the multi-year average quite ordinary. During the last 50 years, as greenhouse gases have poured into the atmosphere, both the number of severe hurricanes has declined and the average maximum intensity of all hurricanes has declined. Those are the observed facts on hurricane behavior. So there's no evidence for increased storminess in the record. And I see news stories that claim that the increasing cost of storm-related insurance losses is a result of global warming because of the seemingly large payouts in recent storm damage. This is bad logic. One must account for the rise in property values in hurricane areas, partly as a result of development. For example, a square mile on Miami Beach is worth a lot more today than it was 60 years ago. Now, to make a fair comparison, one has to compute something called the catastrophe intensity. That's the annual losses of large hurricane events, those between $10 million and $100 million, and then you divide by the number of events that year and then adjust for changes in property value. Since 1950, the catastrophe intensity, or the cost of damage per large storm, really has not increased in normalized property value dollars. So the catastrophe intensity, in fact, in the 1950s was about 20% higher. It was some $50 to $60 million per large storm in current dollars than today's $40 million per large storm. A third news story talks about polar ice melt, which we've heard about this morning. Flooding from the polar ice melt could come from ice that is not floating, and often the West Antarctic ice sheet is named as the archetype for landlocked ice that will soon and rapidly melt and cause severe flooding. But such claims ignore the laws of mechanics and thermodynamics. A recent article in Science explains that the ice sheets are so stable that the heat of climate warming, either natural or man-made, doesn't matter what the origin, would take several thousand years to flow through the ice to the underlying rock bed carrying the ice. The author of that report writes, it would be difficult to see how climate warming could trigger a collapse of the western Antarctic ice sheet in the next century or two. By the way, on the related topic of sea level rise, we also heard this morning that by the year 2100, the sea level rise may be as much as 4 to 8 inches. Now, there are even some models coming out that predict a decline in sea level rise as warming occurs, because at high latitudes some of the snow may get bound up in mountains and therefore removed from the sea level system. Now, my fourth story from the news is butterfly extinction, and this is one of my favorites. The Edith's checker spot butterfly lives in western North America, and news stories said that the butterfly species is migrating northward, quote, to escape rising temperatures, and is going extinct in the southerly part of its habitat, presumably due to global warming. The story got lots of attention because it was posed as a leading indicator of species extinction as a result of global warming, yet another catastrophe. Now, curiously, the original article in the journal Nature made no mention of either the period of time of the study of butterfly extinction and migration, and made no mention of study of the regional temperatures in the butterfly's habitat. In a newspaper interview, I did come across a statement by the author who said that the migration and extinction had happened over the last 100 years in western North America. So I downloaded the UN's data on temperature change for western North America. There's been no warming in the area of butterfly extinction. So whatever is causing the migration of butterflies and their extinction, it has nothing to do with warming, man-made or otherwise. And what was astonishing to me is that neither the researcher, nor the reviewers of the article, nor the editors of the journal, nor the reporters reporting on the story cared to investigate this simple fact, devastating to their hypothesis that the man-made global warming was causing butterfly extinction. Now that's all for the slides, so we can turn those off. And then I have some comments on policy discussions. Despite the lack of evidence for catastrophic warming and its calamities, the temptation is there to adopt a policy of do something. And this temptation is sold as insurance against the possible risk of catastrophe. Now, that portrayal of insurance as a prudent hedge is wrong on 2 counts, notwithstanding the scientific lack of detection of a fingerprint of warming. First, the notion of insurance is one of a carefully calculated premium paid against a risk known reasonably well in outcome and probability of outcome. In the case of man-made global warming, the risk, premium, and outcomes are not well defined, and the meaning of risk has been perverted further. I've heard scientists talk about the risk of catastrophic warming as a probability, say its chance of occurring is 10%. But this is meaningless. Do they mean that 9 times out of 10 it won't occur as predicted? Does it mean that the projections are 90% false? And since the models fail verification, how can one assign a probability of outcome? This word risk has now been co-opted, and it covers up for uncertainty in the climate and the computer simulations. It belies a deep ignorance of the climate physics. Now, more important is the second element of this flawed analogy of prudent insurance, the notion that there is going to be a cost-effective policy of doing something that will make one bit of difference in the increases of anthropogenic greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The problem is that the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will continue to build unless emissions are drastically cut. So one often hears of policies of cutting emissions slightly, but that's not what the facts call for. The buildup of greenhouse gases continues at current or slightly reduced rates of emissions. Emissions have to be cut greatly in order to halt the further increases that are already in the pipeline, so to speak. Now, the Rio Treaty of 1992, which has not yet been ratified by the U.S. Senate, is specific in asking that concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not emissions, be stabilized. In order to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases at current or slightly above current levels, emissions of carbon dioxide and the equivalent greenhouse gases must be cut by 80%. This is a fact. Now, what would a cut of 80% in effective carbon dioxide emissions mean? One example I like to use is that you take away the coal generating capacity for electricity that achieves those cuts. Now, 55% of the electricity in the U.S. is supplied by coal, and to make those 80% cuts in equivalent carbon dioxide, one would have to replace or eliminate half of the 55% of the electricity generated by coal. Half of 55% means a 28% reduction in electricity. Now, if generating electricity from coal could be rapidly and inexpensively switched over to another means which emits no greenhouse gases, then the problem could be solved in theory, and perhaps there would then be some argument for a prudent insurance policy. But the choices are limited. For example, nuclear power emits no greenhouse gases, but it is inconceivable that the institutionalized cultural and political impediments to the nuclear alternative in the U.S. will quickly disappear. Natural gas is not a solution because it still emits substantial greenhouse gas emissions. And please, you can't do it by conservation. Sharp emission reductions through demand-side management just won't work. Similarly, plans of sequestering carbon, my favorite is to grow a lot of trees, clear-cut the areas and dump them in the deep Atlantic Ocean, just also make no sense, and I don't think it's even physically possible. That leaves only one alternative to achieve the treaty's goal, which is to do without 1/4 of the U.S.'s electricity. So what would it cost to rapidly forego 1/4 of the U.S.'s electricity? My rough estimate is that it equals 1/4 of the GNP annually, a couple $1 trillion. The reason is that electricity drives the GNP, and the relation between GNP and electricity generation is approximately linear. And that drop of GNP of 1/4 is about 2.5 times deeper than that suffered during the Great Depression of the 1930s. That was about a 10% drop in the GNP, just to give you some perspective. But wait, it gets worse. China and other developing economies are exempt from the emission caps that are under discussion for developed nations. And that makes emission reductions so hard as to be meaningless. By the year 2025, China will be burning 4 times as much coal as the U.S., and China's carbon emissions will equal or exceed the U.S.'s emissions. By 2025, China's increased carbon emissions will more than equal the reductions that the U.S. will make, resulting in little net improvement in the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is what the treaty asked for. In other words, the U.S. is being asked, at punishing cost, to make essentially meaningless sacrifice. This is futile. The steep reductions in emissions in developed economies will lead to world economic trauma, and that will be an economic catastrophe in itself with severe environmental consequences. The severe cuts will not reduce total concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, as developing economies like China bring massive coal burning online. The phony insurance policy ploy tempts us in believing that we are doing something about global warming, when in fact it is a big lie. Public resources are being squandered on a propaganda of superstition and emotion in defiance of the science and the economic facts. The best scientific evidence says that man-made warming as a result of doubling the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere would be slow and insignificant compared to natural variability of the climate, and therefore non-existent. But what if we're wrong? Despite the best interpretation of all the evidence and the temperature records, what if there is a major global warming occurring, but for some reason we have missed its fingerprint? Well, be of good cheer. I have glad news here as well. The penalty paid in the increase of temperature in the next century by delaying these sharp reductions in greenhouse gas emissions is small. For example, assume the current aggressive case that global warming will cause a temperature rise of 2.5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. In that case, the extra temperature rise that will occur by delaying severe cuts by 3 decades will be entirely negligible, 0.2 of a degree centigrade. That penalty of 0.2 of a degree centigrade would be spread out over a century and will be unnoticeable against the natural climate variability. That seems to be a very reasonable price to pay, while in the interim doing 3 things. 1, decarbonizing the energy economy cost effectively, which makes sense in any case. 2, develop technologies that might make mitigation affordable. And 3, obtain better information on the scientific facts of climate change. Compared to the alternative, it's the humane course of action. Thank you.
We take some questions?
Sure.
Dr. Sallie, as I understand it, we're in the second climactic optimum period on this planet. Can you give us any description of what the carbon dioxide parts per million concentration in the atmosphere were in the first climactic optimum period?
I'm not sure there's real good measurements, but you can look at, I like to look in paleo climate data. I'm not sure, well, first of all, let me say that I'm not sure it was much different than now. Because the climate of the Holocene, I'm sure, is not driven by the carbon dioxide concentration. But I like to give a counterexample by looking back in the Earth's history. And that's to turn to the Ordovician 440 million years ago, when the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 14 times higher than today. The models would predict I don't know, 30 degrees warming, but the Earth was in the throes of an ice age. So carbon dioxide does not seem to drive the climate in a big way. In fact, it may be the response to temperature changes.
I wonder if the Marshall Institute has a specific answer to the report that the Union of Concerned Scientists and the so-called Sound Science Initiative is putting out, claiming that we can dramatically cut carbon dioxide emissions by 20% and have a beneficial effect on the U.S. economy. This includes, by the way, driving nuclear power down to 0% contribution in the economy.
Marshall Institute we're preparing a new brochure on climate change, and we'll be sure to include this issue. Cutting emissions dramatically by 20% is not dramatic enough for the treaty. I want to keep pointing that out. It's the treaty that's under discussion does not ask for 20% cuts, it asks for 80% cuts. So even though that cut is dramatic, it's a false target to be looking at. And second, I just don't believe that it can be done without nuclear power cost effectively, other than by having people do without electricity.
With respect to your graph, we showed the UN estimates of temperature in 2100 going down all the time. What are we going to do when they come to the conclusion that we're entering into a dangerous period of global cooling, and how will we meet this impending catastrophe?
Well, we did visit briefly in the 1970s the danger of the ice age returning. Many of those same people, Stephen Schneider is one of the most famous, who wrote a book about the danger of cooling, and he's now turned around and he's on the warming side. When one looks at the history of humankind, it is clearly the cold intervals that are much more challenging rather than the warm intervals to health and human history. And the current warm period of the Earth, the current interglacial, is not the average state of the Earth. The average state of the Earth is to spend it in glaciation. So typically, of the last 4 million years, the Earth has spent 100,000 years deep in a glaciation, 10,000 years in a warm interglacial. We crawled out of the last glaciation some 10 to 12,000 years ago. So the expectation is that the glacier state will return soon. How soon? Probably it's reasonable to think on time scales of several centuries to millennia, and there would certainly be warming. That is, the glaciers would start creeping down from the high Arctic down into Canada. But that will be more of a challenge than living in a global warming world, which is actually quite benign.
I have a question regarding what happens with the non-greenhouse gases. Are any of those good gases reduced when you have a doubling of CO2 and the increase in the methane?
You mean, say, oxygen or nitrogen?
That we need to breathe.
That's probably not a question for me, but perhaps for Dr. Stevenson or anyone else who cares to answer it. We don't understand the carbon dioxide budget anyway. So I'm not sure that it would be meaningful to then make a spreadsheet and talk about what else would be coming from that. Yes, Howard?
The first graph you showed and other data that has been shown in the past shows the rise in the global temperature measurements that have been verified to be leading the CO2 by 10, 20, 30, or 40 years, which leads a naive physician to think that maybe global warming is causing CO2 and greenhouse gas emission by virtue of driving dissolved gases out of the ocean, which contains a lot more carbon than the atmosphere. Does your new data from the satellites, et cetera, refute that hypothesis that global warming is causing CO2 emission instead of the opposite?
No, there's no good refutation of that. In fact, that I think is the way of the world, is what the physics says. The paleoclimate data is quite clear in this, I think, as clear as it can be. The changes in carbon dioxide occur after the changes in temperature through the last several 100,000 years. So they're a consequence and not the cause. Yes.
Well, I just wonder about all these fossils and the fossil fuels that the global warming crowd is worried about us burning, because I wonder if they have ever wondered where the fossils got their carbon in the first place.
I can't speak for someone else's ignorance.
Well, I was alarmed to note that both you and Dr. Stevenson mentioned that the ocean levels are rising. He specifically said something about 1 millimeter a year. And I did some quick mathematics, and that indicates that in only 1 million years, the ocean levels will have risen perhaps 300 feet. And I wonder what you attribute this catastrophic increase in sea levels to, and how can we circumvent it?
Well, there's an interesting paper that came out 2 weeks ago while we're having some fun. Fellow's been suggesting for about a decade that the Earth is continually bathed in a rain of very diffuse comet snow. This isn't a comet with a hard rock core, but a glob of ice. And that there's tens of these hit the outer atmosphere per day. They're as large as a small two-bedroom house, and they disperse their water and a few other things in them, and that this is enough that over 4 billion years it could have supplied the entire amount of water in the Earth's ocean. So a bigger problem is in 4 billion years we'll have twice as much depth of the ocean water. Now, it's not clear where this comet rainwater comes from, where these comets are coming from. But maybe mitigation is to put up a big net around the Earth and catch them. Perhaps we could divert them to the moon and put some water resources on the moon. Given enough money, I can do lots of things.
What would it cost people of the United States if those who want carbon dioxide reduced were successful, not only in the electricity, but also in driving cars, and finally in the increased production of agriculture from the increasing carbon dioxide?
I'm told that the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is beneficial for agriculture. The warming that's been predicted would be also fairly beneficial. And the increase, so there would be substantial benefit to this. On the negative side, I just can't imagine what the losses are that would offset that, what the danger is. Did I misunderstand your question? Or you're asking what it's mostly beneficial?
Yes.
Yes.
What would be the cost of losing that increase in the productivity from the increasing carbon dioxide if people prevented the carbon dioxide increase?
Well, preventing the carbon dioxide increase would come with such a penalty that you can just start there. You can just say it's going to cost you $2 trillion to make the needed reductions in the treaty. And that doesn't even add in the loss of the expected good benefits that come from slightly warmer Earth and enhanced agricultural productivity. So I just look at the $2 trillion and say, that's enough to make me pause. We could make it worse. $3 trillion.
Per year.
Yes.
Just a point of, I guess, clarification. You said that the treaty, the Rio Treaty, talks about basically stabilizing the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, if the United Nations is supposed to be the world governing body as the ultimate bureaucracy, they're trying to micromanage the world's atmosphere.
Let me read you what Article 2 states of the treaty. The ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So they're busy negotiating that any rise would be dangerous and therefore can't happen. But it specifically focuses on stabilizing concentrations of greenhouse gases. Now it's interesting because then there's a footnote, C note. And you go down to the footnote and it says, what's greenhouse gas mean? Natural plus anthropogenic. So now I have visions of a volcano erupting and the UN helicopters with a cork to come up and put it in the volcano to prevent that natural enhancement. I think this treaty is not based on anything reasonable at all. There's just no scientific basis to it at all.
And it flies in the face of most of the current science about chaos theory and stuff, that systems are not stable.
That's right. That may well be. That may well be. There's another interesting thing is that the Rio Treaty was done in 1992 and it was based on those early projections of the IPCC model, and there's been no mechanism to ask when there is new updated science information, do we then add that into our thinking process on the treaty? The answer is no. It's still based on those discredited high projections of global warming that were made.
Dr. Balinus, are your remarks in publication? And if so, how does one go about getting a hold of it?
We have, I can easily send you this if anybody gives me name and address, or you want to pass around a sheet. The Marshall Institute had a booklet last year that you can request from them. We'll be doing one this year if you want to call them and get on our mailing list for it to come out later this summer. But I'm happy to send this around.
Could you comment on the role of water vapor and its importance relative to these other gases and why we hear so little about it?
Water vapor is the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. I said at the beginning that carbon dioxide and these other greenhouse gases were minor greenhouse gases. They make up about 1% or so of the atmosphere. Water vapor is the main greenhouse gas. The water vapor must be mostly natural. I didn't go into it, but the amount of energy added to the climate system by doubling carbon dioxide is 4 watts per meter squared. Just remember the 4. Now, the uncertainty in the climate models for issues related to water vapor have the following numbers associated with them. We don't understand humidity to the tune of 25 watts per meter squared. So 25 watts per meter squared compared to 4 watts. We don't understand clouds, and I can't even put an estimate on that. We don't understand the flux of motions of heat from the equator to the poles by some 20 watts per meter squared. Now, when the models are run with all those uncertainties, it turns out that the models are wrong over the surface of the Earth, and so it's called a flux adjustment, that area by area changes in the amount of energy emanating from the ocean to the atmosphere and back again have to be fixed. Now, these flux adjustments rise up to 100 watts per meter squared. That is, changes that we're making in the data, in the model output, compared to an effect we're trying to calculate for 4 watts per meter squared. So not knowing water vapor is a tremendous problem, and the problem in the climate models. Dick Lindzen of MIT, one of the world's leading theoretical climatologists, in fact thinks that water vapor, and this is based on some limited evidence of behavior of tropical water and air over the oceans, that water vapor actually quenches any other warming that comes into the system. That is, if you add carbon dioxide, add that extra energy, what happens is the water vapor fairly quickly, in a matter of months to years, takes up that energy, redistributes it, and sheds it, mostly by doing some dynamical work. So in fact, water vapor may hold the key, and not understanding it is quite a loss in this whole debate.
My contention is that the activists can generate new scare theories faster than the scientists can quelch them. And they have already won the battle because they have cost you the effort to spend your time and money doing useless research. So why don't we attack this at the political level rather than the scientific level?
I would be delighted. I come in my office and there's hate email, or there's a letter or something posted, or a stupid newspaper article, and I get to spend my day saying, no, here are the facts. And at some level, I have to do it, but at some level it doesn't matter. The newspaper may not print it. The environmentalists don't care. There's no penalty to them. They still get their tens of millions of dollars a year donation, whether or not they're right. So I don't know what to do but to continue to fight the battle. And as for how politics works, don't ask me, I'm a scientist.
If we cut back as far as you're describing this 80% cutback you're talking about, it will mean the deindustrialization of America, and America will cease to exist as a major nation. Do you feel that this is primarily a political effort to destroy this nation?
Certainly might be somebody's motives. I don't know. I can't speak to the motives, but I can understand why it would be useful to some countries to have the U.S. destroyed. You know, it would destroy the steel industry, the aluminum industry, cement industry, automobile industry, as well as causing a lot of havoc. So I just don't know. I can't comment on whether and why other people might think this is good, but I can imagine, science fiction scenarios. I'm suspicious, yeah, but I don't really know. It's a sociological question.
I'd just like you to clarify this. You're saying that there is a treaty, the Rio Treaty, in front of the United States Senate for ratification that explicitly requires each advanced nation to reduce its CO2 emissions by 80%, or does it suggest that each country try to reduce its emissions? In other words, exactly what does the treaty require? Are there any penalties for non-compliance? Are there, precisely what does the treaty require?
I'll be glad to give you a copy of the treaty, but this statement is the ultimate objective is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate systems.
That's the ultimate objective.
This is a quote from the treaty.
Right, but then what does it require the country to do?
It then requires lots of meetings and international negotiations, and it asks for there to be laws passed by, say, the developed world that would commit those countries to hard emission limits. Now, to meet the obligations of the treaty, it has been discussed, the Conference of Ministers in the treaty has stated openly that it does require cuts of more than 50%, the greenhouse gases, and it does exempt developing economies like China. And in fact, it asks the developed countries to pay foregone growth in the gross domestic product of some of the developing economies should they suffer from any of this. So not only do we have to make these internal cuts, we also have to then fork over some money to help developing economies. There is going to be a meeting in Kyoto in December where it is thought that there will be calls by the participants of the developed countries to then actually put up legislation that call for these hard limits in emission. This administration has been pushing this.
I would suggest that the Marshall Institute get a lawyer, a legal scholar, to deconstruct the treaty and analyze exactly what the various clauses say and what they would in fact require, etc. I think that it would be necessary and very valuable for that to be done so that people could understand precisely what it would be signed if this treaty was signed.
It would be very important, and there's a lot of this information available from the IPCC-related negotiations. That is, their lawyers have already said, this is what we expect you guys to do. And so getting that information out to the public would be quite important.